question. One of you asked me, and I thought I'd begin by trying to answer the question. Is the unemployment statistic that we hear about, and you probably know if you pay attention, that the month of November, the statistics were released this last week, and the numbers were higher than they have been in other months. And much was done. The Obama administration predictably crowed about the fact that, that more jobs had been created than had been expected, and that the unemployment rate is now, I believe, 5.8%, at least the official rate. And what is that? Basically the questions that several of you asked me. So I wanted to make clear to you 2 or 3 things to keep in mind about this. First, economists know that there are patterns across the year. There are some months that are typically more jobs are created than other months. It doesn't vary much. It's the same every year. The month of the year in which the largest number of jobs are created every one of the last 5 years is the month of November. Therefore, if you're going to be honest with your population and you notice a nice spike in November, it's fine to report that you have a spike, but you have to tell people that for the last 5 years there's been a spike, then a drop off the cliff in the next 2 months, nor is it very hard to understand why. In November, we have the 2 major holidays in this country for selling, Thanksgiving and Christmas. Many retail businesses, do more business in the 5 or 6 weeks around these 2 holidays than they do in the rest of the year combined. Therefore, the well-being of a business, if you ask a retail business person, they will tell you, they can't tell you in August or July or April how they're going to be doing this year, because everything depends on the very end of the calendar year. So it's really important to recognize that in November, businesses hire lots of people to be there for the Thanksgiving and Christmas rush, because that's the logical thing. You don't need those people the rest of the year, because you don't do in the whole rest of the year the business you do in the last 6 weeks. So you always hire. This is not rocket science, friends. And anyone who presented the unemployment statistics could have and should have told the public how to kind of understand what the numbers mean. Third point about it. The unemployment rate of 5.8%. Well, that certainly is a lot better than the 9 to 10% that we had in late 8 and 2009 as the thing went bad. But most of the reduction, again, and I think I've made this point earlier, but I want to make sure you all understand, most of the reduction is a reflection of how unemployment is calculated, not about what is actually happening to people. So let me explain. The basic way unemployment is calculated in the United States, in most of the announcements, this is how it's done. There is an actual survey undertaken. Random people are called and they're asked the question. 2 questions, actually. 1, are you working? If you answer yes, then you're counted employed. If you answer no, a second question is asked. Are you looking for work? If you answer no, that is, I'm not employed and I'm not looking, you no longer exist. You're not counted at all. You're only considered unemployed if you're not working, but you answer yes to the question that you're looking. Now, first you need to understand that, but now you'll see why it matters. Suppose from one month to the next, a certain number of people in America, say 500,000, are so disgusted with the months that they've been looking for work, and all they can get is 11 hours a week of being an assistant barista at Starbucks, or something like that, that they say, to hell with it, I'm not looking anymore. I'm going to go and work on my cousin's farm. I'm going to cry, whatever it is that they do to cope with their situation. But then an amazing thing happens. In the 5 months that they were looking, they were counted unemployed because they didn't have a job and they were looking. In the 6th month, when they got the question, or someone like them got the question, They said, I'm not looking. Whereupon the government said, oh good, you're no longer unemployed. So the number of people who are unemployed as a percentage can go down, not because more people are working, but because the unemployed have become what we call in America the marginalized worker, or the discouraged. These are actually the words the government uses. A discouraged worker, a marginalized worker, the person who is no longer looking. We have millions of those over the last 5 years. A major part, not all of it, but a major part of the decline in the unemployment rate is therefore not a measure of improvement, but a measure of the opposite. It's the opposite when people can't find work for months and quit looking. That's not a success, even though the unemployment rate goes down and how shall I be? I'll be polite. A less than totally scrupulous politician uses that fact as if it were a sign that the things are improving and the robust recovery is underway.
Well, this Monday, Paul Krugman in the op-ed was raving about the 300,000 new jobs you were discussing, and so it's positive, things are on the upswing.
Look, whenever there's an announcement that there's hiring, it's kind of positive. It's better that there be jobs that people are getting than that they wouldn't get them. I hope that's all Paul Krugman meant by that. He certainly knows everything I just said as well or better than I do. I would have hoped, I didn't see that particular piece of his, I would have hoped he would have contextualized this a little bit. Well, I'll leave it at that.
Rick,
yeah.
If you've been working at least 1 hour during that week, you're employed.
Right. You have to only be working 1 hour. And the reason I'm telling you this is a statistic I want to give you which fleshes out why you have to be careful. This is a statistic about part-timers. It's a very important question. Because if you're a part-time worker, you're counted as employed because you're employed. But it's part-time. And so the government, having recognized over the years this, asks the question to part-time workers, are you voluntarily part-time? That is, are you working 10 hours a week because you want to do 10 hours? Or is 10 hours involuntary in the sense that you'd rather have more hours? All right, in 2007, and these are numbers from a story in CNN, so can't get better than that. In 2007, the number of involuntarily part-time employees in America was 4.4 million. A lot of people. In 2014, so the 4.4 million was the last year before the crisis hits, 2007. In 2014, the number of involuntary unemployed, 7.3 million. That's not a recovery. That is the opposite. That's a deterioration. That is a situation in which you have actually seen the number of people in that situation almost double by these numbers between 2007 and 2014. And yet, for many of the numbers quoted in the newspaper, unemployment has gone down because we've got an increase in the number of people involuntarily part-time. Bottom line, you have to be very careful in interpreting any economic statistic. Whatever you hear, it's a suggestion. It's a piece of information. But if you don't have the contextual help to understand how it makes sense, it can be used to say almost anything. It's the old joke among statisticians, statistics don't lie, but statisticians do. And that has to do with how they present or don't the information, without which a statistic by itself can mean 1,000 different things. It's very important to remember. Okay. The next short opening piece has to do with something that struck me as remarkable, only because occasionally people are honest. That's unusual, and then government people are honest. That's downright amazing. And here we have one that I couldn't resist. This is from a story in Bloomberg, the financial service, today, December 10th. And it has to do with Luxembourg. Now, Luxembourg is a very small little country. I'm assuming most of you have never been. It's lost there somewhere around Belgium and France and Germany. It's a little place. Population, and last time I looked, about 500,000 people. It's not a very large place. But it's not only a city, it's a country. Well, it's a city with some suburbs, and that's the country. And so they've decided years ago that they don't have enough land to grow much. And why be big in the industry there? Because you got France and Germany and Belgium and all the other places right around it that are bigger and have bigger labor forces. So it's hard. I want you to have compassion. It's hard for the Luxembourg. So what they did is they decided to do something similar to what places like Switzerland have done, or the Cayman Islands, or Bermuda. They allow you to come there if you're a company and to have an office. It turns out if you have a city, you can build lots of buildings that contain lots of offices. And it's not necessary in the modern world of capitalism that there anything go on in the office. You don't have to produce anything or sell anything, you just have to have an office, preferably with a mailbox attached, so that mail can come and mail can go. And Luxembourg is chock full of offices. And in these offices, the following transaction happens. The Luxembourg government enters into arrangements. Arrangements. I have no idea what the word means, but they're comfortable with it. They speak about it all the time. These are arrangements with corporations to give them preferred tax treatment. Preferred tax treatment could be loosely translated as low or no taxes. Low or no is a more clear, simple English, but preferred treatment is better for the Wall Street Journal story. But you all understand it's for low taxes. This has been famous for years. But it's all kept secret because they have laws, like in Switzerland and the other countries, that there's no reporting of any of this, so it's very hard to know. Thanks to modern technology, a lot of this business is done by computer and email. And as you all know, everybody and his brother can now listen and watch whatever it is you do on email or in your computer. So a group of journalists, decent men and women, and if you're not familiar with them, they've become very active. They're called the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. I kid you not. The ICIJ. And they go around and do a great deal of snooping. They're professional journalists. And they like to snoop in those things that journalists have traditionally, of the muckraking type, have liked to do, to catch things that people don't know about. So over the last few months, they have done some more work, and I now want to give you a listing of the companies they have disclosed who have these special arrangements in Luxembourg. And before I read you the list, I want to make sure you understand the economics of it. Take a company. I'll pick one out of the hat, one you've heard of. PepsiCo. You know, the drink, PepsiCo. Now, PepsiCo makes a lot of money. This is a very big, a very successful company. All over the world, people drink whatever that is that's in that bottle or that can, and they drink a lot of it. So PepsiCo makes a lot of money. Since the drink, I don't mean to disparage anything, but the drink is, as you know, sugar and dark-colored water. It turns out that sugar and coloring and water are cheap. Cheap, it doesn't cost anything. But you pay $1 for a glass of the sweetened, colored water. Therefore, the difference between the cost of the drink and what you pay, even deducting the cost of the can, which exceeds that of the drink, is enormous. They make a lot of profits. This raises a business problem which courses at business school are designed to deal with. Okay, you got a big profit, now you got a problem, Mr. or Miss Businessman. You're going to be taxed on that profit. Profits are taxable. So here's your problem. In the United States, the flat corporate tax rate, official corporate tax rate, is 35%. So technically, most corporations do not pay that, but because there's deductions and all kinds of arrangements, you can get well below that. But you start with a calculation that you're obliged to pay 35%. If you go to Luxembourg, and if your profit shows up in Luxembourg and not in New York, your tax rate could be between 1 and 5%. Now, most of you will notice there's quite a difference between 35% and 5%. Enough difference that we're talking billions of dollars in that company alone, and I'm going to give you a lovely list of companies so you get an idea of how popular Luxembourg is. Now, what happens is the company then sets up an office in Luxembourg. I mean an office, 20 feet by 10 feet, 2 desks, 2 wastebaskets, a cat, and a mailbox. And they fill out some forms, and they have a subsidiary. PepsiCo, I'm just making this up, so it's hypothetical. PepsiCo of Luxembourg. Often this will mean not 1 can of this stuff is sold in Luxembourg. Doesn't matter. It's an accounting mechanism so that the profits show up at the subsidiary of PepsiCo in Luxembourg rather than showing up on the books of the parent company in New York. Therefore, the profits are taxable in the jurisdiction where they occur. So they pay a tax to Luxembourg. The reason the company does it is it drops its taxes from 35% to 5%, saving billions. The effect on the United States is that vast amounts of taxes that would have been paid by American companies to the American government, thereby funding schools, hospitals, roads, and all the other stuff that the government does, is never received in the United States. A small fraction of it is received not in a country of 325 million people, but in a country of 500,000 people. Of course they're happy with 5% or 3%. They're still ahead, percentage-wise, of what we've lost. This is a disaster, and it's not just happening to the United States. British companies do it, German companies do it, companies from many parts of the world. So I just want you to understand what a wonderful thing free enterprise can be when it has good relationships with governments in places like Luxembourg. So here we go. I'm going to read you some of the companies that are involved, and then I'm going to read you a wonderful statement by the Finance Ministry, an official statement released to Bloomberg today when Bloomberg went, the reporters, and asked about this. So first the companies. Ready? Here we go. These are companies that are now revealed to have these relationships with Luxembourg. Walt Disney. Even Mickey has such a deal. Microsoft's Skype unit. PepsiCo. The IKEA Group, the furniture folks. The FedEx Corporation. And who arranged this? Who arranged this for them? The following. PricewaterhouseCoopers. Those of you who know, that's one of the biggest accounting firms in the country. Deloitte LLP, that's another one. KPMG and Ernst & Young. That's it. That's the basic big shots of corporate accounting. They all have been doing this activity. Nor are they alone. The Hong Kong-based Hutchinson Whampoa, the private equity firm Warburg Pincus. I don't want to miss any. Amazon.com, the Fiat Corporation, Starbucks Corporation, Apple Corporation, and on and on and on. And now the statement from the Finance Ministry. Pay attention. This is one of those moments when a government official either has had too much to drink or has had a moment of an attack of terminal honesty. Okay. Quote, and anyone who wants to see this is from Bloomberg today. Luxembourg agrees that the legitimacy of certain mechanisms which are compliant with international and national law can be put in doubt from an ethical point of view. It takes genius to write crap like this. I mean, you got that? It's okay. Doubts can be raised. Okay? Here we go. Non-double taxation agreements and the interaction of different countries' tax systems, here we go, now quote, here we go, can lead to a significant reduction of a company's tax burden, comma, or even no taxation at all, period. It's a burden, you see. They've relieved a burden. The big company came with a burden, and Luxembourg lightened the load. You have to feel a little bit here. You have to understand that, yeah, you could doubt this all if you had an ethical point of view, which clearly the people I've mentioned don't suffer from. They don't have that kind of point of view, or if they did, they lost it, and maybe they'll get it back. Why do we have a crisis of the government's finances in the United States? Why do we have terrible deficits in the United States? Why does the government have to make up the deficits? One of the reasons is corporations, and I just gave you a list, a small sample, are avoiding to pay billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars by these mechanisms. And it's wonderful for Luxembourg. So for those of you that travel to Europe anytime soon, and if you go to Luxembourg, enjoy the parks in Luxembourg because you paid for them. Okay. Next, and this is something I don't do so often, so I thought I would do it this time. Given the way capitalism works, it's not my point of view, of course, it's the way capitalism works. Much of what I say in these meetings has a certain critical quality, you might say. And so I like on occasion to break from that and praise somebody, but you'll see it's sort of a game. The person I want to praise, someone I presume you all know, is Senator Bernie Sanders from the small state of Vermont, a state that, if I'm properly informed, has more cows than people in it. On the 2nd of December, Bernie Sanders released a 12-point economic agenda for America. Very interesting, and I really urge you, we don't have the time here, but to look. This is an interesting 12-point agenda. It's interesting that a senator in the United States says such things. And there might, what you would imagine, raise the minimum wage, provide equal pay for women, transform energy systems away from fossil fuels, invest in our crumbling tax structure, expand security and Medicaid, and so forth and so on. Comment, just historically. Traditionally, what I just read off would be the Democratic Party thing. That's what they would say. That's what they said for years. But now the Democratic Party has a hard time saying these things. It's become much more realistic, less burdened by an ethical point of view, for example. So it's left to the one, I believe he's the only member of the United States Congress who actually calls himself a socialist. So he's a socialist. He's in the Congress. He's a senator. But the socialist really can't do much better than what the Democrats used to do, which does suggest a kind of, whoa, have things moved? Because the Democrats won't say it, and the socialist, instead of keeping a position to the left of what the Democrats used to say, which they once did, is now reduced to kind of being the Democrat when the Democrats aren't Democrats anymore. It's a little complicated, but you can kind of stay with me. But I want to give him credit for topic number 3 of his list of 12. I'm going to read it to you. It's very short. We need to develop new economic models to increase job creation and productivity. Instead of giving huge tax breaks, which we just discussed, to corporations which ship our jobs to China, he could have added, and our accounting systems to Luxembourg, but he left that out, and other low-wage countries, here we go, we need to provide assistance to workers who want to purchase their own businesses by establishing worker-owned cooperatives. Study after study shows that when workers have an ownership stake in the businesses they work for, productivity goes up, absenteeism goes down, and employees are much more satisfied with their jobs. Well, I take my hat off. Here's a politician who has actually heard about worker co-ops as a new and different way of conceiving what the work experience and the workplace are like, or could be like, and wants there to be more of them. That's good. And I wanted to give credit. There are very, very few politicians who have figured that out, and Mr. Sanders is one of them. Okay, let's turn then to the topics that were foremost for tonight. And I picked these, by the way, based on things you all send me and things that happen on the radio station, and just a sense of what's in the air that people might want to know about. So let me begin with what is in many ways the easiest, and that is Ferguson. I mean, you could add the Garner situation here in New York, or half a dozen of these events that, of course, all get press because it's in the air now. Even though these events, as anyone who follows this stuff will tell you, happen all the time. They don't get the attention all the time, but they're not as unusual as much of the press reporting would like us to think. I'm not going to repeat all of the stuff you can see in the newspapers and that you've thought about. I thought I would talk a little bit about the economics of all of this, since that's what we do here. So here's the economics. A metaphor. A metaphor is a medical metaphor. If you go to a doctor, say you have a pain in your elbow, in your leg or something, you go to the doctor and you tell him, this hurts over here when I do that. You will sometimes have a doctor who will look you all over and tap you and do all the things doctors do, and then tell you, which might at first be a little bit shocking, and then he kind of explain it to you. There's nothing wrong with your leg, or there's nothing wrong with your arm. What there is you have a kind of a problem. Take an example. You are really overstressed. And when your body is overstressed, you're working too hard, you're not getting enough sleep, you spend all day long eating cold pizza, that kind of thing, then your body rebels, and your body has a kind of difficulty, and whatever, here we go now, whatever is a kind of a weak part of your body, a part that you may have injured years ago, or a part that you just inherited a certain way, that's where the problem will show up. Your leg will hurt, but it's not your leg, it's this stress that is, in a sense, looking for the weak place to manifest itself, to show up. And therefore, you're not going to get work done by the doctor on your arm. You're going to get a doctor who talks to you about stress and helps you with the stress, because if you can manage the stress, your leg, your arm, your elbow will take care of themselves. Okay, keep that in your mind. We have an economy that is under extraordinary stress. This is the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. It has lasted longer than anyone foresaw. It has cut deeper than anyone foresaw. The number of statistics that show this are limitless. The information about involuntary part-time that I gave you 10 minutes ago is just another example. People are under enormous stress. And in a capitalist economic system, when stress affects an economy, everyone in the system uses whatever mechanisms they have to relieve the stress, which often ends up meaning moving it off of me onto somebody else. That means the stress tends to settle to the bottom. It becomes the bigger problem, the less resources you have to escape it, to moderate it, to soften it. So, end result. If you have a problem in the society that there are enormous gaps in the amount of resources people have to cope with stress, and that's what an unequal distribution of wealth and income means. Some people have the wealth that can mollify or soften the stress, others don't. So the people most affected are the ones with the least capacity to cope with the stress, number one. Number two, if you have a society that has a weakness, and Lord knows, I assume I don't have to explain to you that the relationship between white and black Americans is a weak point in this society and has been from day one. That means the stress is going to blow up in poor neighborhoods where the racial division is acute. Ferguson is what? It is a very poor place in which you have a white police department and an African American, poor, stressed community. This is an explosion just waiting. But there's more to be said. It's not just that Michael Brown and countless other young men and women like him have no job prospects, no future, no visible hope of getting out of the situation they're in, which is being resident in a community that doesn't have many public services that are left, no jobs, I mean, just on and on and on. It's not just that. It's also that every city and state in the United States has been deprived now of revenue, tax revenue, for years because of the unemployment, because people don't have money to spend, so there's not as much sales tax coming in. So the cities and towns don't have, and the states don't have much money. That means they cut back public services. That includes the police. They don't have the time to train police and the money. They don't have the time to give police some time off. You've got a super stressed police department. So you've got a racial divide, an explodingly overstressed mass of poor African Americans, and an underpaid, overstressed police department. This is lunacy. A society that permits these conditions to fester cannot then act surprised when it blows up. The only surprise is it hasn't blown up in 10 places. Not that it blew up. To read the newspapers, I won't mention any names, expressing shock and amazement that this should happen is bizarre. Nor is the solution a commission to look into this. You must be kidding. Another commission to look into this again? We know what the solution is, don't we? If people had jobs, if people had decent incomes, if decent prospects for doing better if they work hard and apply themselves, and you had the income that could then allow public service to be handled properly, then we would have maybe a solution. Otherwise, this is a game, a make-believe game in which we decide, let's see who we'll blame. So some of us will blame Michael Brown, and some of us will, I forget his name, the cop who killed him, or what, you know, we'll have our favorite demons and we'll get very angry at them, and we'll miss the fact that this is a situation into which no people ought to be put. Neither the Michael Browns nor the police. Asking the police to try to manage a situation that is so utterly out of control is itself absurd. That's not a manageable arrangement. This is not an excuse for what happened. But it's not a manageable arrangement. And even if we got rid of the cops that are clearly out of control, we're not solving the problem. The next ones who replace them will be under a level set of pressures and constraints where we can not do other than expect them also to fall into these behavior patterns. It's an old problem, but it seems to me the United States is now reaping the fact that it did not deal with this crisis in a reasonable way. Again, to remind you, in the 1930s, when we had bad unemployment like this, the government of the United States, because of pressure from below, created a public employment program. It created 15 million jobs. That's a lot of jobs. That'd be a lot of jobs now. It was even bigger number of jobs then. Between 1934 and 41, 15 million jobs, and filled it with 15 million unemployed people. Those people got a decent job, they got income, they could therefore maintain their mortgage payments and keep their homes. So you didn't have the foreclosure situation you have now, and you didn't have the unemployment. And they also could pay their taxes, and they also could sustain therefore their communities. We have now had 6 years of a terrible downturn, terrible unemployment, and the amazing thing is not just that we don't have a public employment program like we did. We don't have any major politician who even brings it up. It's like a wholesale American amnesia about its own history. It's not that many years ago. The history has been written 1,000 times. Take a course on the 1930s, which many colleges have. You'll read all about it. There's nothing secret about it. There's nothing. But we as a nation, we have president and Republican, and nobody thinks it ought to be discussed. And if you broach it, the political people in charge will tell you, wow, it's very expensive. It is. I mean, you're going to hire millions of people. It's expensive. So we didn't do it because it's expensive. Instead, we have Ferguson. And that isn't expensive. It isn't. Come on. It's costing a fortune. There's a fortune in every community that's terrified that it will have a Ferguson this week, next month. The calculus of what's expensive and what isn't is never innocent. It's always a question of what you're thinking of and what you're counting and what you're not. This country is paying a spectacular price, reopening the intensity of racial animosity across the young people are going into the streets. I walked out of my apartment. I don't live very far from here. I think it was last Monday or the Monday before, and there were thousands of people walking down the streets about Ferguson. So, you know, I'm so excited when I see a protest march, I join it, and then I figure out what it's about. So I joined this one, and then the young people, they were overwhelmingly young people, explained to me that they were just upset about all of this. Well, that's a good sign, but it's a very strange society that can look at this situation and come up with almost any kind of explanation other than the economics of it, which seem to me to be screaming at us for recognition. All right, so that's enough about that. I don't mean to get preachy. Okay. I'm going to change.
You just sound like the Democratic Party.
Do I?
You just sounded like the New Deal. I'm not being critical, but I mean, you were being critical earlier, right?
Yes, yes.
Did you just get pulled to the right?
Absolute. No, good point. Very good point. Not so much pulled to the right, since if you come here often, you'll see that I do other things. But on this point, that's right. I brought up the New Deal. And the gentleman's absolutely right. That's like what I said about Bernie Sanders. I'm in the position, normally well to the left of the Democratic Party, to say the least, but I'm in the position of reminding my audiences about what the Democrats did back in the 1930s, because for them it's a shock, it's a rude awakening of what would be possible. So yes, I am playing on that very change in American politics that makes it someone like me on the left, who is the one who brings up the dilemma of a society that has forgotten its own history, that has moved so far over in what is official discourse that it needs to be reminded by someone way left of the Democrats of what the Democrats once did. Although, to be fair, as I've tried to do when I explained the 1930s, the reason the Democratic Party did that in the 30s was because something much to the left of them forced it. The CIO, the two socialist parties, and the Communist Party of the United States, working very closely together, basically went to Mr. Roosevelt and said, you better do this or else there's going to be a revolution. And Mr. Roosevelt sat there, listened to them, and was a smart politician and realized they meant what they said, and he wasn't going to call their bluff because it was too dangerous. So he cut a deal. The wealthy would pay the extra taxes to allow him to do the New Deal. The CIO, the socialists, and the communists, for those of you not familiar with the history, they accepted that deal. Not everyone, but most of them. They were so excited, they were so surprised that they were going to get what they demanded, that the notion of a revolution was put back a little bit, was downplayed. That was the deal. That was what Roosevelt demanded. He said, if you keep talking about revolution, I can't get the money for Social Security, unemployment compensation, minimum wage, and a public employment program. But if you shut up about the revolutionary crap, I can get you all of those other things, and the deal was done. And I like to remind everybody that this deal, which now Democrats would think is an unmanageable, impossible idea, made Mr. Roosevelt, I love to remind Americans, made the man who did it, the politician who took the chance, he taxed the rich to provide lots of services to middle and low income people. He was reelected president 4 times, something no other president had ever achieved. The man who taxed the rich to help Americans was the most popular president the country ever had. You might wonder, especially now when the exit from power of Mr. Obama is soon upon us, that he might be wondering what kind of, if it's true that he worries about his legacy, he might be wondering whether the choices he made of what to do and what not to do in terms of what people remember of him were perhaps not the best ones he could have made. Anyway, let me move on. But it was a good point you made about exactly what I'm doing. Oil. A whole number of you have asked me to talk a little bit about the oil, and I'm going to combine that with Thanksgiving, because the Thanksgiving economics is also important. But first, oil. Before I talk about the specifics of why oil prices are dropping and what that means, first you have to understand how the oil market in the world works. Oil is an essential, in some ways, the essential commodity of our modern economic system. It's not just that oil is how we move on a truck or a car or all the vehicles. And it's not just that oil is the way a large number of us heat our homes. Oil is everywhere. For example, petroleum, is a basic builder of plastic. And everything that we use that's plastic, or a great portion of it, is derived from oil. Plastic is a product of treating oil in a certain way, chemically. You may not know it, but oil is the major ingredient of most of the mass fertilizer that is used in this country. So the food we eat depends on the oil that produces the fertilizer without which it can't be grown. So whether you're moving in a car, or having a sandwich, or being warm in a cold evening, or unwrapping the sandwich which is in the plastic, you're dependent on oil. So oil is something the modern capitalist world economy is absolutely dependent on. The billions of us on this planet depend on oil in innumerable ways every day. So keep that in your head. Now, something like 15 or 20 countries control the supply. Those governments, together with large companies, often located in those countries, that's it. They're the ones who bring it out. A tiny group of people, many of them not elected, and even if they are elected, with the money that's involved, a tiny group of wealthy people elect them. They make the decisions. So the first most amazing thing as an economist to tell you is, you live in a society that ought to make you very frightened and very angry, because it is the most stupefying affront to democracy you could imagine. A mass of people having become totally dependent on something that 15 or 20 countries, tiny groups at the top, control the supply of. All right, now keep that in your mind. You can imagine that these 15 or 20 long ago figured out, if we get together, we can rip this planet off like you never saw. We just have to get together and kind of agree on how much oil we bring up for all these dependent addicts. Because it really is the metaphor you want. It's an addict. It's the people who control the heroin and then all the people who need it, or the ecstasy or the cocaine. You know, or if you don't, you should. So they've gotten together. The oil companies used to manage it. It used to be that what they call the Seven Sisters, the big 7 oil companies would get together. Then their monopoly was kind of strangled when the Third World became independent after World War II, and now countries became important. Countries became important. Places like Saudi Arabia or Iraq or Iran or Venezuela or Nigeria, the places that are big ones in this game. And so deals had to be reworked. The Third World countries, in order to push against these big companies, developed OPEC, a way for them to get together and change the rules of the game. And the big oil companies didn't want it, didn't want to let these little new countries get involved. Some of you know American history. The history of our country's horrific relationships with Iran begins when the Iranian people put into office a man named Mossadegh back in the 1950s who wanted to have an independent oil and take it away from the Arabian American Oil Company, or Anglo-American Oil Company, that was controlling it. Okay? So whenever a new player enters, and then there has to be a deal. You know, it's like, remember your crime movies? When a new gang comes into the neighborhood and they want to be on those corners, something's got to be worked out with the old gangs that used to be there, or else there's going to be war. And then they shoot each other, and we have blood in the street until a deal is made and a new arrangement. That's the reason Americans love those movies is because it's the substitute for what they all know is going on in a much scarier place. Not in that neighborhood and not over dope, but actually about things they depend on, like oil. Same game. Okay, so what's happening now is a struggle. Things were working really well. That is, the oil producers were ripping us all off fantastically. They were making money like you never saw, all those oil companies. And it was producing bizarre situations. One of the greatest assemblages of wealth in the world is in the desert in Saudi Arabia. This little country sits on a mountain of wealth. Another country that got no people but enormous oil wealth is Norway. One of the largest investment, they're called sovereign wealth funds in the world, is the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. Russia, which has had terrible problems since it liberated itself, has been sustained in large part because it produces oil and gas and could participate in these high prices. Hugo Chavez could not have been what he was in Venezuela were it not for the fact that they are sitting on oil. And the horrific slaughter of the Nigerian people, one against the other, is part of their struggle because they are either lucky or unlucky, depending on your point of view, because they have oil. And Iraq, I mean, what can I say? Look, Iraq has been pushed back 50 years in its development because it has oil. So, fantastic things happened to keep it going. And wars were created. I won't mention any, but I imagine many of you can imagine. We've gone to war to control the oil. But a new thing changed in the last 3 or 4 years. And that is that a major oil consumer that had worked everything out in this system among the, let's call them the 20 thieves, the 20 oil countries, that had all been worked out, and then the United States discovered in where? In North Dakota, that there's this kind of formation, shale, under the ground, that has in it, like a sponge, oil. And that you can get it out by this thing some of you've learned about called fracking. Pumping chemicals at high pressure down and bringing that stuff up. And suddenly, the United States, from being a massive importer of oil, is producing more oil than it itself needs, is becoming an exporter. And now the question is, it's like a new gang in the neighborhood. How's this going to get worked out? Who's going to suffer? And the United States is pumping oil like crazy, asserting, like a new gang on the block, we're important. You got to take care of us. And it's a bad moment because the world economy, despite what it says in the New York Times, isn't recovering. It's in terrible shape. So the demand for oil around the world is down because factories are not humming, because people are not driving, because people are poor and becoming poorer, the mass. So the demand for oil is going down. The United States is pumping like there's no tomorrow. And what you get, if the demand is down and the supply is up, the price starts to go down. In the past, the Saudi Arabians, who have more oil than anybody, I always have to stop at this point and ask those of you of a religious bent of mind to think about the fact that the greatest supply of oil in the world, put there by who, should be in Saudi Arabia. But anyway, I'll put it aside. Just something for you to think about. In any case, Saudi Arabia typically in these situations does what we call make the market. If the supply is too much and the demand is not there, the Saudis stop pumping. Down goes the supply, whoop, that goes up the price because it becomes scarce because the Saudis aren't pumping. All that has happened now is the Saudis have said, yeah, the price is going down. Yep, it's the Americans making it happen. But we're not going to suffer. We're not going to cut back production and therefore not have as much to sell. We want to be as rich as we always were. We're not going to allow the United States to take over our corner. We sell coke here, not them. And that has to be fought out. And that's why the oil prices are going down. No mystery at all. This is a fight among the 12 or 15 who now have to cut a new deal to figure out where the United States' fracking explosion, how that's going to be handled, what will the price end up being, and who will be hurt. And when this happens, it's like a war among the gangs. The best thing is don't go out at night because the shooting will happen, and if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, you lose your left ear, right? So don't do it. And so now the chips are falling, and let's quickly go through what the chips are. First, the attempt to survive as a Hugo Chavez socialism is going to be very, very hard in Venezuela. I wouldn't bet on it because they need that oil. And as the price of that oil goes down, what can sustain that socialist effort may disappear. Mr. Putin is sitting on a Russia that once was the Soviet Union, but a Russia that depends extraordinarily on oil and gas revenue. And that is cutting back, and that's hurting him. That's hurting him big time. And no one knows quite how that's going to work. Then there are other countries, including here in the United States, where things are a little bit different. On the one hand, here in the United States, it's kind of good for the average consumer because the cost of filling the tank in your car is going down. And the cost of heating, if your home is heated with oil, it's going down. And the cost of other things are going down. The cost of fertilizer was going down. That doesn't, by the way, mean that the price of food will go down because the farmers, if they're concentrated, they will be very happy to pay less for the fertilizer and charge us the same for the food and pick up the difference for themselves. Can they do that? Yes. Will they do that? Probably. So no one knows exactly how this is all going to play out. It was supposed to build us a boom here in America because we were supposed to believe that with people saving on filling up their tank of gas in their car and saving on home heating fuel now that it's getting cold, et cetera, and we would have a lot more money to spend, and that would show up on Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, and Americans would go and spend a ton of money, which they did not do. Spending this year is 10% below what it was last year, and that's a lot. So the expected explosion of consumption didn't materialize. Meaning what? Either people don't have the money or they don't feel good about spending it. But either way, recovery is not what this signals. No recovery is what it signals, and no recovery is what it produces. Because with a lot less stuff sold, a lot less orders to the companies to produce anything because they can't sell it. But back to the oil. What are some of the other consequences? Well, here's a couple you may not have thought about, but are very important. What do these 12 to 15 countries do with the enormous oil revenues they were getting until now? You might have thought they would develop their countries. Most of the money was not used for that, partly because most of the money is caught into the hands of very, very rich people and families and groups, and that's not what they're into. So what many of these countries did, Norway, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and so on, is they take the money and they invest it. They deposit it in banks. And you know where? Banks in New York, banks in London, banks in Paris. Or they buy shares of stock in companies around the world, but particularly the biggest ones. So in fact, it turns out that having high oil prices, this is very important if you get this, is a way of taking a lot of money out of each person's pocket. High oil prices takes a little out of your pocket for your gas in your car, a little more out of your pocket to heat your home, a little more out of your pocket to pay the high prices for the milk and the corn and the vegetables you buy, and a little more money, you get the picture? And all of that money taken from billions on the planet collects in the hands of a dozen countries and a dozen companies. This is a way of, ready? Taking from the mass of people and concentrating in a very few hands. Concentrating in a few hands so much money they couldn't possibly spend it. They would have to be able to spend the same as a billion people, and nobody can do that. It is therefore fundamentally irrational. It deprives a mass of people who would have spent that money because they don't have enough money to do anything else, and concentrates it in the hands of people who have now so much that a large part of it they don't spend, and that's bad for the economy, isn't it? It's a little bit like the absolutely crazy effect of lotteries. Think about lottery. For those of you, it's the same model. A lottery means every one of us spends a couple of bucks less because we buy those tickets. The government collects from all of us $3, $4, $5 a week, or whatever it is we spend, and gives it all to 3 people who are now wondering what to do with, I now have $40 million. You can fantasize how wonderful it would be, but actually economically, this is crazy. Those people aren't going to spend that money. They're going to stare at it for 24 hours, and then, do what? Buy a few luxuries and then hoard it, which is exactly the opposite of what our economy needs. A lottery is economic craziness. And in an economy that's not doing well, it's craziness squared. Oil is like that. It collects from everybody and gives to a few rich. So they put the money in the bank and they buy shares of stock. And here's a scary prospect which worries folks on Wall Street. All of those, they're called sovereign wealth funds. They're the funds set up in the oil countries to handle their wealth. They take all that oil wealth and they buy shares of stock. By the way, some of our major corporations like Citibank they're owned by the wealth funds. I believe it's still the case that Citibank's largest shareholder is Saudi Arabia. For those of you that have an account at Citi, I want you to know where your hard-earned money is going. But you knew that. I know you knew that. You must have known that. You wouldn't go through life without knowing it. So guess what? As the oil price goes down, they're not getting the money. And if they're not getting the money, they're not buying stocks the way they did. When the money isn't collected by the oil people, but is instead we all have a little bit more in our pockets because the price of oil went down, we are not the people who buy shares. So for the stock market, this is scary. This better not continue very long because it is destroying a major buyer of shares of stock. For those of you who didn't pay attention, the stock market dropped 300 points today. That's a lot. And the reason it dropped is that this recognition of one way this oil thing could play out is beginning to get people freaky. The good news is I can fill up my tank for less. The bad news is if stock markets go down, I'm not going to have a job and I won't be able to buy any gas anyway, whatever the price is. What's the benefit here? I don't want to get into speculations about how this all will work out. This is a problem mathematicians call too many variables. You can't solve the equation because there's too many things going in too many different directions. But I don't want you to lose the punchline. We're living now, and we will live in the consequences of an absurd situation in which billions of people on this planet are held hostage by an economic system called capitalism that concentrates the wealth in the form of oil in literally 20 hands, 20 decision-making entities who are not accountable, not responsible, and are manipulating this market the way they always have, but now in a time of turmoil. And we're going to live with the turmoil because we permitted this situation in the first place. Thanksgiving, the last words about Thanksgiving, and then we go to the last topic. 10% less than last year. You can cut that any way you want. That's a disaster. Is it possible that there will be more buying between now and Christmas that will make up for it? It's always possible. Not much reason to expect it, but it's possible. The hoopla around Thanksgiving, for those of you who paid attention, is the greatest it's ever been. For days before, they had kind of pre-Black Friday, Black Thursday, or whatever it was, or Black Wednesday, or Green Wednesday, or whatever it is. They were hyping it and hyping it and hyping it. But you put it together, and it was 10% less than last year. The big part of the recovery we're in was supposed to have happened over the last 12 months. It should have showed up in a better Thanksgiving, much better. It showed up in a much worse one, and everybody who pays attention to this is wondering what's going on. Is it that people don't have the money? Is it that they have it but they're afraid to spend it? What's going on? Much of the guessing, by the way, is that the culprit here is the growing inequality of wealth and income. More and more of the income is concentrated in a smaller number of hands. Those people are buying more, but there's few of them. Whereas the mass of people are buying less, and there's a lot of them. And then we have the result that we have. It's also suggested by the fact that generally, if you look at it, the higher the price of the item over Thanksgiving, the better that the company was doing. If you were buying your gifts, which I know many of you were, at, say, Tiffany's, then it was crowded. But if you found your way into the Walmart basement, you were all alone. I'm exaggerating, but you get the idea. The people at the top are doing very, very well. On my radio show, I found a wonderful statistic. In the business of private airplanes, which you may not know about, a lot of you, but there are people who, when they fly, don't stand in a line and don't have to take their shoes off or put things in a plastic tray. They don't have to do any of those things because they have their own airplane. Well, it turns out if you want to buy an airplane in the $1 to $5 million range, there's a lot of airplanes for sale and the business isn't good. But if you want to buy a $25 million airplane, you have to wait 6 months. The market for the big, expensive is crowded. There are a lot of people in that market. But those who just want to buy a $1 million airplane, there are not very many of those. In other words, the concentration of wealth is not just that you all don't have it, but unless you're in the top 1/10 of 1%, you don't have it either. The concentration is extraordinary. That's why you get that crazy number, which I misquoted last month. I'll try it again. That, what is it? The richest 400, help me.
85 and now it's 70.
The richest 85 people have as much wealth as the bottom half of the globe's population. Okay.
It's changed to 70.
Okay, and it dropped to 70. So the 70 richest, you know, Mr. Warren Buffett and Bill Gates and Carlos Slim from Mexico and those folks. The top 70 have as much wealth as 3.5 billion people. I mean, you know, the only way to understand this is to think in terms of what you may remember when you were younger, when you read about the pharaohs in Egypt. 8 million people who didn't have enough to eat, and then one guy who could build a pyramid so that he had a place to sit when he needed shade or something. Okay. Last item. And I leave this for the end because it has a certain good news quality, and I don't want to leave you depressed or anything. Remember, there's a pleasure and an enjoyment to understand what's going on. That's what motivates me to do this, so I'm hoping it conveys to you that there's a certain understanding is its own pleasure, its own satisfaction. Especially if the situation is grim, understanding it may be the only way to make it deliver some positivity to you. But there are good things happening, and there are good things happening in 3 countries. And in fact, one of them blew up yesterday, so it's very appropriate. The 3 countries are in Europe. They are Greece, Spain, and Ireland now has joined them. And let me explain to you what is going on. In each of these countries, the same story played out. Really, it's the same story as played out here in the United States. It's the crisis. And I want to make sure you all get it, so I'm going to very quickly review. In 2007 and 2008, capitalism fell apart. Or to use the language of the book I wrote around that time, capitalism hit the fan. That was a title chosen because it was designed that you would have the mental process of substituting another word for capitalism, and then seeing that the joke was that there's an equation. You get the idea. Okay. Capitalism it fell apart. And the banks went kaput, and the insurance companies went kaput, General Motors went kaput, and country after country, it collapsed. Massive unemployment, businesses shutting. I mean, really cataclysmic. And in that situation, the capitalists, the people who owned and operated the big enterprises in France, in Germany, in England, the United States, in Canada, Australia, Japan, wherever, did something remarkable. And it's so enjoyable for me that I have to share that with you. Having spent the previous 30 years denouncing the government as a burden, as an intrusion, as holding back the power and creativity of private enterprise, all these private enterprises begged the government to save them. I mean that. They begged. The head of Morgan Stanley and Citibank got on their private jets and went to Washington and begged George Bush. Then they had to explain to George Bush who they were. It was a mess. But they got it across. They got it across. You must save us. You must save us. And the same thing happened in all the European countries. And the politicians, I'm proud to say, were up to the task. They did exactly whatever it is they were told. Everywhere. Do you need money? Here. Is that enough? The central banks, in our country it's called the Fed, but in England it's the Bank of England, in France the Bank of France, gave them money, loaned them, gave them, invested them. How much? Trillions. T, plural. Trillions. Loans, investment, here, every bank will save you. In many countries the government simply said to everybody, don't worry, if the bank has fallen apart and can't honor the obligations, like you're a depositor, you'd like your money back, and the bank doesn't have, don't matter, we'll take care of it. The government simply stepped in and, the language we came to use, bailed everybody out. If it became necessary to get the economy booming again, the government spent money like there's no tomorrow. And they had to, because in the private capitalist economy, everything had fallen apart. It never was that there wasn't enough money. All the companies had money, but they didn't dare do anything with it. They didn't lend it. No bank would lend to another because it was too unsafe. You wouldn't know the next day that that bank was even there. Remember? Lehman Brothers, one day, boom, it's gone. If Lehman Brothers owed you money, you were out of luck. So nobody moved. Everybody had money, but nobody moved. The system collapsed, like freezed. Think of it as a freeze. And so the government had to come in and solve it. And the government did. It said to everybody who was out of money, here. Now, how did the government get all the money to save all of them? It had 2 options. It could have taxed everybody. In which case, there would have been a bloody revolution in all these countries, and we wouldn't be sitting here today. Because the American people were not about, nor would the British, nor the French, nor the Germans, were about to have an economic crisis that's wiping everybody out, and then the government comes in and says, oh, you all have to give me $10,000 more taxes now that you're unemployed. So nobody did that. It also would be kind of crazy because then whatever the government is spending is negated by the fact that people have to pay taxes. They don't have that to spend. So it made no sense. So the government did the logical thing, logical in capitalism. To save capitalism, it has to spend a ton of money. It can't raise it in taxes, so it borrows it. But here comes the good part now. Ready? Where does the government borrow the money to save the capitalists? The answer is from them. Because they're sitting on all this money. They don't trust anybody. They're not going to loan it to anybody. But to the government, they'll give it because they understand that if they don't, the game is over. We're not talking capitalism. We're talking about, will you make it through the night? So the government, you got to love this, saves capitalism by spending the money it borrows from the capitalists. And for the privilege of borrowing from the capitalists to save them, it pays the capitalists interest. Folks, you live in this. I'm describing what you live in. This is not crazy. This requires a word beyond crazy that I don't know exists in the English language. So every country did it. Every country borrowed like there's no tomorrow. Just to remind you, in 2010, 2011, the United States deficit went up by $1.5 trillion a year. It went up more in one of those years than it took 30 years before to do. We borrowed like there's no tomorrow. We had to. Nobody asked the question. No Republican, no Democrat worried about it. Not even Ron Paul. They all said, let's do it. Yes, of course, we must save capitalism. So they did. They borrowed the money. As soon as that was done, they announced that the problem isn't that we have millions of unemployed. No. The problem isn't that businesses are going out. No. The problem isn't that we are unable to fund our public services. No. The problem is the government debt. What? The government debt. The government's in debt. Of course it's in debt. It just borrowed to save capitalism, you idiot. No, you see, it's not good to be in debt. What? You just created the debt to save them. Now you're worried about the debt. Yes, and because we're worried about the debt, you see, we've got to do something because the government's borrowing. So here's what we got to do. We either got to raise taxes so the government has more money so it doesn't have to borrow and can reduce the debt, or we'll stop spending money on schools and hospitals, and we'll use that money to pay down the debt. We won't have to, you see? So the solution is now to understand we've gotten out of the crisis. It's 2010. Unemployment in the United States is 10%. We're out of the crisis, really. So we got to focus on the problem now, which is the debt. And we're going to solve the debt by raising taxes and cutting government spending on social programs, which is called, not in this country, but in other countries, austerity. Here it's called prudent fiscal management. But it is whacking the mass of people, isn't it? Because by taxing them and cutting spending, which is what we had here, the payroll tax in the United States went up 50% in January of 2013 in this country, and we've been cutting government spending on everything. We've been bringing the deficit down, haven't we? Barack Obama and the Republicans struggle with each other over who's going to take credit for this great achievement. This achievement means that the crisis of capitalism, which the government bailed out, is going to be paid for by the average citizen who pays higher taxes and gets fewer government services. This is a society that has an economic system that collapses and makes you, who had nothing to do with it, pay for it. Now, if I had more time, and I don't, I would stop, as I often want to do, and play the national anthem. I'd ask each of you to put your hand over your heart thanking whoever it is you believe in, that you're lucky to be in this lunatic asylum that I have just described to you. Well, you can imagine that there are people, I'm not the only one, who don't like this, who think that what's going on is in fact what's going on, that the mass of people is being asked to pay the freight, to pay the cost of a crisis they did not bring, from which they did not benefit, and from which nobody bailed them out. They don't want to pay. Strange idea. And they would like to change everything, the government, so that they stop being made to pay for this crisis. Okay? Now, in the three countries, and I will bring this to an end in 5 minutes, the three countries, Greece, Spain, and now Ireland, that is becoming politically achieved. That is, new movements are developing that are dead set against what's going on and taking powerful positions. It's gone the furthest, and you must pay attention, in Greece. Now, here's the form it takes in Greece. Greece, like the United States, had two major parties, the New Democracy Party and the Greek Socialist Party. They changed, one was the president, and then the next one was, or the prime minister, and the next one was, the way we do with Republicans and Democrats, one, then the other, you pretend it matters, and all that. Okay, you get excited about it. They did that. And normally 60 to 70% of the Greek voters voted for one or the other of those parties. Those two parties together captured the big bulk, like the Republicans and Democrats do here. In the last two elections in Greece, those two parties together got about 28, 29% of the vote. The middle of Greek politics vanished in a matter of a year and a half. And what emerged was a small left-wing party that had been getting about 3 to 3.5% of the vote, called Syriza, 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 led by a young man named Alex Tsipras. You're going to hear his name a lot. Tsipras, Tsipras. In the public opinion polls in Greece today, that party comes in number one. They are no austerity. We will not pay back the loans. They were not done in a democratic way. The people cannot be saddled with these loans. We will not have austerity. We will not raise the taxes. We will not cut the government. We aren't playing. And, hint, he doesn't say it, but hint, if we're forced to, we will leave the European Union. And we will all be able to once again look at something called a drachma, which was their currency before the euro. It's so tight. The unemployment in Greece is 26% right now. That's greater than it was at its worst moment in the American Depression. Greece is losing large numbers of young people who are leaving because there's no work there. I mean, you're destroying that society, and you've been doing it for 6 years. And this is the reaction. And this is the number one political party. A left-wing, socialist, Marxist, anti-capitalist political party. Yesterday, the president of Greece, in a desperate effort not to succumb to this party, called for a snap election later this month. As a result, the stock market in Greece lost 13% of its value yesterday, the largest drop in the history of the stock market in Greece ever. Today it lost another 1 or 2%. Greece is at a point, if this maneuver of the president doesn't work, then there will have to be an election, either February or January, and at this point, Syriza will win. Every government of the West, Britain, France, Germany, and the United States, will be pouring money legally and illegally, we don't do illegal things, legally into that society to try to shape this election and prevent this from happening, because this is a real domino problem. Because if Greece goes, who's going to go next? Well, let me tell you. In Spain, which Greece is a little country, very small part of Europe. Spain is a big country. Spain, I believe, is the 4th largest country in Europe after France, Germany, and Italy. So Spain is big. Spain, the middle, has also fallen apart, and the new big party is called Podemos. You heard about the Indignados. They were sort of like the Occupy Wall Street, but in that country. Well, they have now developed a political arm called Podemos. And if my Spanish is correct, you'll enjoy this. It means, yes, we can. You can guess where they got it. But they're not Obama politics. They are way to the left. And they are emerging as an anti-austerity party with massive political support. And the third example is really remarkable, is Ireland. Ireland had 2 political parties, and now suddenly an old party that's been in Ireland a long time, a party that used to be the political wing of the IRA, a party that comes out of the whole struggle of Ireland against England, called Sinn Féin, are now suddenly picking up 25 to 30% of the vote. They may become the #1 party because they've decided to become the party against austerity, led by Gerry Adams. Some of you know, has been the leader of that party for a long time, a very famous politician in Ireland. So here we have 3 countries, very different, Greece, Spain, Ireland, all of them showing that if you keep doing this, then you're going to get, or at least you have a big risk of getting, a serious, powerful political resurgence of the left. The United States is just a little further behind. But there's no reason to believe that the forces that are working in those 3 countries and elsewhere in Europe are not also percolating under the surface here. And even the little things, the decision of the church to very kindly let us continue these during 2015, and the reception that we're getting, and the growing number of stations that allow us to broadcast our radio program every week, these are signs that, believe me, I never expected to see in my lifetime as an American. That the openness to what it is that I say in these meetings and what I write and people like me is absolutely remarkable. Okay, I've kept you here over an hour and a half. I want to remind you, please, use social media if you can. Let people know if you like these sessions, if you think it's worth listening for an hour and a half on a video. Let people know. I hope to see you the 2nd Wednesday of January when we will resume this in a new year. Thank you very, very much.